Alrighty, so we have done our stitching. The next thing that we need to do is make our bias binding. Now, what I have done is I have cut on a 45-degree angle strips of the fabric that I'm going to use, and this is what I'm going to use for my piping. Now, what I am going to come and do is, so this is the bias cut strips of fabric that I'm going to use for my piping. And for the two pillowcases that I will be making, I have used probably about maybe 20 centimeters of fabric. It's a difficult one because you do cut it on that bias, so there is that little bit of waste, or as we could probably think about it instead, there is that little bit of leftovers. And then what you want to be doing is folding that in half and pressing it really well. And what this is going to do is just give our pillowcase just that little custom, elegant touch. Other ways that I've seen piping used really well is if you use it on, like particularly on pillowcases, go the same colour but do satin. And piping is just one of those things that, again, elevates your projects up the next stage. Okay, so here is my folded tape. And then what I've got here is a 3.5 millimeter cord. And what we're going to do is open up the tape, lay the cord down the center of that, and then I just want to come through and stitch using a zipper foot as close to that cord as possible. And I'm going to use a wide stitch, probably 5-6 mil, and I'm going to use water-soluble thread so that I can easily remove that once I've stitched this into the project. So let's come over to the sewing machine. Okay, so here I've got my piping and I've got my fabric. I'm going to adjust that as I come through and make sure at each point that that's just at the perfect point. But all I'm going to do is gently stitch that down. And if I end up stitching over it, which I can see I've just done ever so slightly just there, I'm not too worried because remember at the moment I'm using wash away thread. And that's all going to come out anyway. And the one thing that I was actually taught to do with piping cord is when you get to the end here is to actually come off and stitch at that end so that you cannot accidentally pull that bit out. And I think that's probably a really smart idea. And let's come over to our workbench. And what we are left with is piping cord. Now, you might be able to see there, I have gone a little bit cattywampus at different stages, and that's absolutely fine, simply because this is wash away and we will be changing that. Okay, so now we are ready to start putting our pillowcase together. Have you ever done a little rolled hem using your sewing machine? It is such an easy stitch to do. And all I'm going to do is come through. I'm going to thread my machine up, and then I'm going to come through and select my rolled hem on the machine, and this is the plate that we use. Now, all I'm going to do, you can see here, is just pop that fabric just in there. Now, if I then just and look at what a beautiful, perfect little hem the machine is doing. Now, if you do something silly like I there, all I've done is I've got that fabric underneath there instead of on top. You're just going to come through and lift that up. And how beautiful a seam does that give us? That is your rolled hem foot. And most of the janome machines come with one of these. And if you're anything like me, you have it there and you just don't use it. So consider using this beautiful foot for your next sewing project. Okay, so we've done our seam, and this is going to be the part that actually holds our pillow into the pillowcase. So what I want to do is I've come through, and what I like is on these I've got a very specific, I've got one side that's a beautiful luscious side and the other side that is quite dull. And what I want to do is with my wrong sides together, so that's my two dull sides, I want to come through and I'm going to get my clips because we are going to join that fabric. Now, I know what you're thinking. Hold on, what's she doing? Why is she putting the two wrong sides together? There is method in my madness. We are going to do beautiful encased French seams. So wrong side together, and then we're going to turn it right side out and stitch that seam beautifully. Okay, so what you can see here is my seam. Now, one of the nicest things you can do when you're doing any sort of stitching is once you have sewn the seam, then press it into place with that all closed. You will be surprised at just what a difference that does make to your stitching. Then I'm going to come through, and this is called trimming or grading the seam. Now, grading the seam is normally when you are just cutting one side of the seam line. I want to come through and trim that to about half of its original width, so that when I turn it back, I get a beautiful narrow seam. And French seams, of course, started off in the times when we did not have things like overlockers. So to make your clothes and your seams last for longer, they would use a French seam. It is also the seam that is used a lot for sheer clothing. So once I've got that, I'm then going to come through and I want to press that seam open. And then we use our fingers to roll that flat. And what that is going to do, after we've pressed and pinned and then stitched, is give us a beautiful enclosed seam and a really professional look. Now, if you have an overlocker and you do want to do it that way, look, there's no judgment from me. But this is a great time to, of course, learn a new technique. Okay, let's come along and we're going to stitch all along here on a very narrow stitch. I'm just going to come through. And again, I'm going to stitch on that 3/8 of an inch, so just that little bit lower than a 1/4 inch. And what we should now find. Okay, so I'm back over at the workbench now. This is what the inside of my seam looks like. And this is then what the outside of my pillowcase looks like. Well, actually, brutal honesty, this is the inside because that's where the pillow is going to sit in. But what it does is it gives you a beautiful finish. So very, very happy with that. And because we've done that small seam, it really hasn't taken up any more room in the seam allowance. So that, for those of you who haven't done one before, that is a French seam.